I'm going to be talking to you today about a topic that I love dearly, mutant cactus. That's right, this isn't some science fiction fantasy land craziness. This is real plants that have suffered from genetic mutation to look like absolute freaks. Now, I'm going to be covering off on two things today. The first one, giving you a bit of a brief overview of the nature of mutations in cacti. Then I'm going to show you some of the coolest examples that exist, whether they be in nature or in cultivation. So, hang in there with me while we explore this crazy and fascinating topic. Let's get stuck in, shall we? Now, when we're talking about mutation, what we're really talking about here is some kind of genetic alteration in a plant that causes it to grow in a different form to its usual shape. So today I'm going to focus only on two different types of this mutation. The first one is what we call monstrosity. Now, monstrosity or monstrose plants are those plants that have undergone some kind of change to their genetic structure and now resemble nothing like their usual plant growth. The second type that we're going to be talking about is what are called crested plants. The technical term for these is fasciated plants, but you can also hear the word cristata. And these are plants where the growth point is growing elongated rather than usually vertical. The end result are plants that are growing in either a fan-like or sometimes even brain-like structure, like this one. Now, what causes these mutations, you might ask? Sometimes it's purely genetic, an alteration at the seed level that causes a plant to grow in an atypical fashion. Sometimes it can be the result of a virus or some other pathogen that enters into the plant and transforms its structure. And sometimes it can just be damage to a growing point, maybe snail damage or slug damage that causes the plant to start growing in a different way to its usual form. Whatever the case might be, these plants are genuinely fascinating, quite rare, and a truly interesting subject to explore today. Now, I'm going to show you some of the most interesting of these plants that exist in cultivation, and later in the week I'm going to release another video that shows you how you can grow your own, if you're lucky, from seed. So let's begin this exploration of mutant cacti by looking at some of those monstrose plants. And where better to start than with that strange little freak I showed you before. This plant is called Mammillaria bocasana, with a name in cultivation of Fred. Whoever named it clearly has a bit of a sense of humour. Now, ordinarily, Mammillaria bocasana grows as a sort of small clumping cactus, quite furry with hook-like spines. But this weird, spineless, rubbery looking thing, clearly quite atypical. You can see the texture is quite warty, even in some places quite rubbery. It's a bit squishy overall, quite hideous. However, to some, this is a thing of beauty. A clear representation of some of the ugly forms that these monstrose plants can take. In time, it will also grow into a clump, but you need to be careful because it's quite susceptible to rot, and that clump can collapse in on itself, leaving you with nothing. It does flower, but the flowers are sterile. This can't be reproduced by seeds. Therefore, you need to take cuttings to ensure the continuation of this particular cultivar. Now, it's not to say that all monstrose plants are hideous. I'm going to show you now an example of a plant that's actually quite stunning. This is Eulychnia, castanea, Varispiralis. Now, Eulychnia castanea in nature is a fairly unassuming, almost quite typical looking plant. Low growing, quite spiny, grows in South America. However, at some point in cultivation, many years ago, a strange and unexpected genetic variation occurred. And the end result is this stunning, stacked, disc-looking spiral with spines emerging between each layer. Now, this particular plant is not entirely stable, and by that I mean that it doesn't always hold its form. Sometimes these can grow into crests, sometimes they look like kind of melty, watered kind of things. But when they emerge with this particular form, they are perhaps one of the most unique and stunning types of cacti available in cultivation, and quite rare. Now there is another plant, also quite beautiful in its form, which is becoming more common in cultivation. That is this one. This is a form of Myrtillocactus geometrizans. Goes by the cultivar name of Fuku Roku Ryuzinboku. However, it's more commonly known in Western cultivation as the blue booby cactus. And I think its form is indicative of where that name comes from. Again, quite sterile, doesn't flower, so all of these plants have come from cuttings. Imagine that. One plant somewhere in the world throws out a shape like this, and then it just gets cut and cut and cut again. The end result being that these are readily available all over the world today. Now, sticking to that human anatomy theme, something a little less beautiful, but no less remarkable. This is Trichocereus bridgesii monstrosus, commonly referred to as the penis cactus, again for quite obvious reasons. In nature, Trichocereus bridgesii is a tall, columnar growing plant. Nothing like this low growing, clumping, shrubby thing. They do have quite large spines, however. And perhaps one of the more interesting facts about this plant, and a reason why it is so commonly grown, is because this is actually loaded with psychoactive alkaloids. I'm growing it just for appearances, but there are many collectors who would grow it for a very different purpose. Now, not all of these monstrose plants appear solely in cultivation. And I can show you now one that actually emerged originally in natural habitat and has since been collected and entered into the horticultural trade. And that is this plant. This is called Lophocereus schottii, with a common name, the totem pole cactus. Now, again, a fairly nondescript, spiny, columnar plant that grows in nature. However, there is one stand of this plant that underwent some kind of genetic mutation in habitat. The end result is these spineless, almost melty looking columns. So you can find these in their natural habitat of Baja California in Mexico, and they've since been collected and entered into the nursery trade. There are different forms of this. This is a fairly narrow version, but you can also get some that are a little bit girthier. Very interesting and very strange looking plant. Also doesn't flower and therefore needs to be reproduced only through cutting. How on earth does a wild population of these survive? Well, over time, parts of the plants either collapse or fall over. Those parts take root in the ground and a new plant or clone is born. Very strange, very surprising that such a mutation has taken hold in natural habitat, but it shows that these plants aren't solely unnatural and purely appearing in our man-made collections. They are just a natural part of the genetic diversity of plant life. Now, there are many other monstrose cacti available out there, And indeed, if you sow enough seed or you take enough cuttings, or they might just emerge on a new bit of growth in a plant in your collection, these new plants, new cultivars, new strains of mutation can emerge anywhere. However, I think that gives you a good representative sample of the nature of monstrosity in cacti. So next up, I'm going to talk a little bit about crests, fasciation, and show you a fantastic couple of examples. So now let's talk about crests. I said earlier that crests on plants form when the growth point elongates for whatever reason. And the end result is these fascinating, sometimes brain-like plants, as in this form. Now you can see there's this ridge running up the middle of this particular plant. Now that's the growth point, that rather than growing straight up, is in this case growing wide. And as it runs out of space, it begins to take this brain-like shape. This particular plant is a Trichocereus peruvianus hybrid, grown from seed by me. And these are plants that can be reproduced in some instances by seed. And I'm going to tell you all about that in the next video that I release a little bit later this week. Now, of course, there are also those crested plants that grow with more fan-like form. And you can see that fan up here. This particular plant is a crested Myrtillocactus geometrizans. Goes by the cultivar name of Elite Crest. And it's quite a stunning plant. Now the thing about crests is that they can sometimes revert back to their ordinary form. You can see a reversion just here. Occasionally these will recrest, and so you can leave it there and hope, but sometimes they don't, in which case the simple solution is just to chop it off. So that's crested plants for you. Now the interesting thing is that both crests and monstrosity can occur in any plant. Indeed, they can occur in any part of the plant. You can have crested or monstrose stems, leaves, flowers, roots, and yet for some reason they are particularly common in cacti and indeed succulents. And so, as a cactus collector, you're more than likely to encounter these stunning, bizarre and somewhat alien plants as you expand your collection. I will be releasing another video a little bit later this week about how you can produce your own plants and some of the pitfalls to avoid. Because these plants can be quite collectible, there are a lot of scammers out there. But until that time, happy growing. I'll catch you next time. Feel free to subscribe or don't, whatever makes you happy.